Jason, thank you so much for joining me from Nashville, Tennessee. It is such a an honor to see you again after all these years.
It's been a long time, Rachel. It's so good to see you, and I'm grateful to be here. Thank you for having me.
Of course. I've been wanting to have you come on the show for a long time because I think the topic that you really cover, which is recovery and addiction, is such an important one. It's a universal one that everyone, I think, can be touched by if they are not struggling with something. They know someone who is struggling, and I just think it's a really important topic. But we're going to get into that. I've known you for many years, but something I don't really know because I've never asked you about is how you became the Jason Wahler that everybody kind of knows. Can start by telling me who you were as a kid. Tell me about Jason that we don't know.
Yeah. Okay. So, Jason, as you don't know, as a young guy. I'm the youngest of four kids. I got two older brothers and an older sister. Was born and raised in Newport Beach, California. Amazing parents who are still married till today. They just celebrated 50 years of marriage. But had just a very amazing upbringing. Parents who were very loving, caring, compassionate, who instilled amazing morals and values in us. And growing up, I was an outgoing kid. I loved, surfing, skateboarding, snowboarding. Loved sports. Loved playing baseball. Was just a very outgoing individual. And I'd really lost sight of who I was around 12 or 13 years old. At that age, I actually was diagnosed and struggled severely with OCD to the point where I'd wash my hands until they would bleed. And this is something that a lot of people don't know about my backstory. Is when I was going through that, I've seen every type of psychologist, psychiatrist you can think of, and back then there's only so much at 12 or 13 years old, there's only so much you could do or try to explain back then, and when you're going through it. And when I saw those psychiatrists, I saw the therapist, I was put on medication. It helped mitigate the symptoms, but I never really dealt with the underlying issues. And so after doing all this work on myself, I identified that I really, I can see how I almost struggled going through addiction and all the different things that I did. I can see how I basically struggled with addiction way before I ever picked up the drink or the drug. And what I mean by that is, as that young kid that I was explaining to you, the outgoing, that loved the sports, loved these different things, was always a part of the popular group, had a girlfriend, whatever it may be. I was able to divert what was really going on behind closed doors and living this double life. And so I had a lot of these insecurities. I had a lot of, depression, anxiety, all these different things that were going on as a very young kid, which was very challenging. But again, so going back to, after seeing therapists, psychiatrists, taking medication to mitigate the symptoms, I didn't know how to communicate that. Even my parents knew what was going on. But when you're 12, 13 years old, 20 plus years ago, right, the times are completely different.
Mhm.
I did not know how to communicate that. I did not know how to express what was going on. And so as a young kid, there was a lot of stuff going into my, adolescence, early teens, late teens. There was a lot of stuff that I was dealing with that was never really unveiled.
Mhm.
And I struggled even at 16, 17. So that's fast, streamlined into, ultimately struggling with addiction. And by the age of 17, I actually went to boarding school out in Provo, Utah. Prior to that, I actually went to a wilderness program where you actually go out into the woods and you're out there for like 30 days to do some self-discovery. And then I came back to a boarding school. And then, from there, I think, part of that struggle though really enticed a lot of the stuff for the show because, at that young age, obviously I was dealing with a lot of underlying issues, but also masking that with alcohol and different things. So it created this unique perspective and or character, if that makes sense. So
Yeah. I'm curious if a lot of those things you went through starting at the young age you were talking about, 11, 12, do you think that stemmed from the fact that you had something wrong, like this OCD, or you think it's just like typical, peer pressure? There's a lot of emotions and physical things going on. You're changing. I'm curious because we both have kids, right? And I think it's a good
mhm.
conversation to have. Like sometimes it's not some traumatic event that somebody like can't get over in their childhood. Sometimes it's just growing up is hard. So what was it
No,
for you?
100%. Well, after again, you have to understand I've done a lot of work over the years, right? So I mean, we're talking
Yeah.
about 20 plus years of work. So I've been able to actually identify. So the long story short answer is I actually just found out a couple years ago that I actually had pandas. That's where it's pediatric autoimmune I forget what the acronym stands for, but it's actually where strep throat attacks the part of the brain that creates OCD. So that's where really the OCD had stemmed from.
Mhm.
But prior to that, I mean, look, I'm pre-genetically disposed to addiction, right? I mean, like,
Yeah.
look, I'm Cherokee, German, and Irish. I mean, when I came out of the womb, I should have had a stamp on my forehead saying, "Do not give this kid any form of substances." But
Yeah.
I think there's definitely, obviously, there's the peer pressures and there's the things that you go through. But that was a really big turning point, and I really, even after all these years of work that I've done, I really can kind of like pinpoint now that that's where a lot of my, like, when you start to uncover things where people, whether they have traumatic events, whether they, whatever that
Mhm.
may be that they've gone through, that was a really big piece of my life that I never really identified with, because again, when I, you know after I started taking medication, started going through those things, I kind of was like, that's not the problem. You know what I mean? But like, that's where like kind of the root cause came from. And that's where, after, all the therapy sessions, all the doctors and everybody I've met with, I think that's really kind of where a lot of this stemmed from, was not properly dealing with or addressing those issues. And again, we did the best that we possibly could given the state and the time that we were in. Right.
Yeah.
So, and I'm sure there's other pieces that played into it. Yeah, there, just, I mean, just the pressures of growing up, especially in Southern California. There's a lot of pressures that come with that. That definitely added to the issues.
Yeah. You mentioned going to a wilderness school and then going to Provo. I also went to a wilderness school, so I know what that is. We have different sets of parents, as you know, because we did our show
Yeah,
together, and I think you remember. And I remember your parents, who are amazing. You, like you spoke about, grew up with very, involved parents who clearly cared about you, and I think you were going to go on your path no matter what. I had the experience, and I've met a lot of people who their parents didn't know how to handle them. And I think that happened with your parents a little bit. So they send you away to try and figure it out because they can't figure it out. And sometimes that backfires because those wilderness programs or those therapeutic schools, I don't know if the one you went to in Provo was one of those therapeutic ones, but for me, I felt abandoned. Like I felt like they didn't understand me. Nobody understood me. I was misunderstood. And that sent me down a different road. How did you feel about that?
well, it's funny because, I mean, my parents, being who they are and the way that we were brought up, they over communicated. It wasn't like I was kidnapped in the middle of the night. Like there's stories like that where kids are literally taken, and where we sat down, and honestly, for me, that's where, like, I could see, some of the symptoms of addiction, right? Or the lying, the manipulation, all those different things. I mean, I was kind of under some heat going through that process. So we literally sat down and we communicated, like, hey, what would be best, and for me, I was kind of like, yeah, I'll get out of Dodge. You know what I mean? I think it would be beneficial for that. But I think ultimately it was really to take some of the heat of what was going on, just from bad grades and ditching school and this
Yeah.
other things that were there. And I was like, yeah, let's blame it on this. And so again, when you're that young, you're so impressionable, and you're just,
Mhm.
you're impulsive. And so, but my parents did a good job of communicating around, and they were very supportive in a lot of those decisions that we'd made.